War Room Sports, www.warroomsports.com. What? Ain't no more to it.
Is the founder of urbancusp.com, which is a online publication that's becoming wildly popular in the past year or so. She also just won the Impact DC 2012 Leader of the Year Award, and we're going to bring her on right now and find out how it feels to be the 2012 Leader of the Year. Rahel, are you on the line?
I'm here. Thanks for having me.
You are in the War Room. Thanks for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
It's exciting. We've been talking for a long time, so it's finally great to have a public conversation.
Yes. So we're going to jump right into it. So I'm going to let Akil start off.
Hello, Rahel. This is Akil.
Hi, Akil. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It is a pleasure to have you on our show this evening, and I have a question to ask you. Please explain to our listeners exactly what Urban Cusp is and your inspiration behind creating the site.
Definitely. urbancusp.com is an online lifestyle magazine. It intersects faith, politics, global awareness, progressive urban culture. And what I mean by progressive urban culture is that it's a lot of what many of us are passionate about, hip-hop and entertainment and music and fashion, but looking at it through a lens that is also meaningful. So not entertainment just for entertainment's sake, but really looking at how all these things affect our identity, our contributions to the world. So if we're talking about maybe hip-hop, we're talking about it in a way that you're probably not used to hearing. And it's gone beyond just an online magazine. We've also hosted a lot of events and a lot of interviews, and I'm really looking forward to what might come in the next year.
Yeah. How you doing, Rahel? This is Jimmy. I'm a huge fan of your blog. You know, I tweet you and send you Facebook messages sometimes when I read the articles. So I'm glad to have you here in the War Room because, like I said, I am a huge fan and I read your blog every day. With that being said, you were recently named the Impact 2012 Leader of the Year. How does the mission of Impact coincide with that of Urban Cusp? And what is the significance of winning this award to you personally?
Impact is an organization that whose work that I admire greatly, and their focus is ensuring that people of our generation are committed to issues of politics and social awareness. And a lot of that has to do with civic engagement. Are we voting? Are we politically aware? So this is obviously all the things that Impact does. While Impact has a focus that oftentimes relates to policy and the work of congressional officials, we tend to have a more on-the-ground approach. So how does this play out in people's everyday lifestyle? And so you bring the two together, and what we both try to do is really look at how we can be politically and civically engaged on a daily basis, but then also what happens in a big election year like this one. What do we need to do to ensure that we're vote ready? And so for them to recognize me as the Impact Leader of the Year, I mean, it means a lot to me, especially because when I developed Urban Cusp a year ago, the last thing on my mind was awards. It was really just about my passion and what I wanted to share with the world, and it never occurred to me that a year later I'd be receiving a recognition like that.
Wow. Gotcha. Rahel, this is Bradley. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. So you're a journalist? I said you're a journalist, theologian, social activist, you're Urban Cusp founder, you're a writer for the esteemed Washington Post and philanthropist. Of all your accomplishments, which accomplishments have been the most rewarding to you, and tell us a little bit why?
Well, when I look back at my life, honestly, it's my entire life story. I sometimes talk about where I originated, but, a lot of the success that I have to date means so much more because of my story. And, I came to America as an undocumented immigrant. I didn't speak any English. I went to all public schools, never had private education until, college. So in large part, it's just my story in general that I think I'm often most proud of. Now, recently, I was obviously very proud of winning the Impact Leader of the Year award, and I was also very proud of the position I got at the Washington Post, particularly because I grew up in D.C. and, I used to see the Post as like this media icon in the city, and, to have just known that I started as a freelancer in Southeast D.C., and now I'm writing for perhaps the second most popular and largest media outlet in the country. So it means a lot to me.
You grew up in the area, huh?
I did.
All right. This is Devin, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to discuss some social issues in our world, which is the world of sports. ESPN recently ran a documentary entitled Broke, which highlighted the fact that a large percentage of professional athletes, and sadly to say, a lot of these former athletes were black. They face financial troubles only a few years after retirement from their particular sport. We also did a show on this here back in the War Room, probably November of 2010. Do you have an opinion on what the outlying factors may be that leads to this phenomenon?
I think it's a very important question. Financial literacy is obviously a major, major issue with athletes, particularly African-American ones. It's very similar to, in some ways, we often say that the easiest ways for African-American males to become millionaires is to either become rappers or athletes. And it's one of the fastest roads that a lot of them, take. And it's not to say that it's not a road that requires hard work and determination, but oftentimes they make it there without having been properly prepared. Because oftentimes they're going from these urban communities where they're not equipped with a lot of, resources in the community to understand how to be more fiscally responsible. They get all that money, and they're in many ways acting the way they would have if they would have still lived in those same communities. And as a result, they don't have long-term spending habits in mind to ensure that they're not just living for today, but they're planning for tomorrow. But I think fiscal responsibility is just one of many examples, because another issue is how are they adjusting in terms of, mental health? How do you go from no one knowing your name to millions of people knowing your name? And when you go through that overnight success, how do you psychologically and emotionally deal with that? But also even relationships, a lot of them go from having, a girlfriend to countless, women who are seeking them out, and are they protecting their bodies? So I think financial literacy is just one of many examples of how athletes need to be prepared for a lifestyle that will forever change who they are. And based on, some connections that I personally have in the sports world, I definitely have heard of life coaching courses that a lot of them go through, but it probably needs to be institutionalized more.
Yeah, because in most sports, rookies will go through a rookie symposium, but that's like a 1 or 2 day thing. They may get 30 minutes of someone telling them what they should and shouldn't do with their money, but many of us we just don't think that's enough. So we kind of sometimes it's you're walking a fine line on what the league's responsibility is in it versus what the player's responsibility is in the whole thing, but I guess they do have to take a bigger look into it, because you are giving millions of dollars to basically teenagers. So I don't know. You shouldn't just throw them out there to the wolves.
Right. I mean, they have an individual responsibility, but I mean, also, what's the role of mentorship? You use the phrase rookies, but there are also seasoned and veteran athletes who have been around, and know what to do. And they could institutionalize mentorship in such a way where the older players are offering guidance to the younger ones. But it's oftentimes so individualistic, that they might have a team, and you see the cohesive identity when they're out on the field. But how supportive are they of each other when they're off the field? Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. Rahel, I have a question I'm dying to ask you. Is due to the popularity of the Lingerie Football League, the November 2012 debut of the Bikini Basketball Association is almost upon us. as a woman, how do you feel about what many perceive as objectification of women for the sake of athletic entertainment? I mean, some people say, hey, it's all fun and jobs, but at the end of the day, this is not the WNBA. This is the Bikini Basketball Association. What's your opinion of that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, when I watch boxing, and they have the women in the bikinis come out and they hold up, the posters telling you what round it is, I cringe, because I see no value in that whatsoever. It devalues the woman, it devalues the sport, and it makes women props that are just, put in these athletic arenas for male enjoyment. I really think that it is archaic. It's gotten to a point where we're so advanced in society that it's kind of almost despicable, some things that we still allow to get done. Now, granted, women have full agency, so these leagues wouldn't exist if women weren't a part of them, right? And you could also say that there's nothing wrong with, highlighting our beauty and our sexuality, and every woman has a right to celebrate that if she so chooses. The problem I have with that is, I'll use the example of this. There was recent controversy over the fact that First Lady Michelle Obama and Mitt Romney's wife engaged in a bake-off. And this is actually something that happens, every time there's a presidential campaign. I believe that it started in 1992 during Hillary Clinton's tenure as First Lady. And the point is, it may not be lingerie, but it's still a way in which women are in the backdrop in these very traditional roles of our bodies or our sexuality or our cooking skills, whatever it is, and we're not prided for our intellect, for our brilliance, for our personal accomplishments. So I personally, would have as much problem with one as I do the other, and I think lingerie obviously brings in another element, but it's still a way in which we devalue the contribution of women in society.
Right, because actually, if you take a peek at one of those football games, the level of play is probably higher than a lot of people expect when they turn to that channel. But, then when you're being serious, you have to ask yourself, why do they have to do this in lingerie? It's kind of a weird mix there, but
yeah,
sex sells. Sex has always sold, and they're capitalizing off of it right now. What else?
It is the way of the world. Rahel, black protectionism is a term used in and outside of sports to describe racially biased analysis and commentary of famous athletes and people of African American ethnicity. To use a sports example, there's a notion that some black people actually overrate certain athletes simply because they feel a certain duty to protect or go easy on these athletes because they are indeed, they're black. Taking it outside of the realm of sports, do you think this way of thinking is healthy for the subject being discussed, or do you think the lack of objectivity hinders the subject in their attempt to be all they can be?
Okay, so for the sake of our listeners, I'm going to ask you to say that in a very dumbed-down way.
Dumb it down?
Dumb it down just a little bit.
Dumb it down. So a lot of times you'll have black folks that will, I guess, turn the other cheek or turn a blind eye to an athlete's behavior or an athlete's stance because he is black. We can use Michael Vick as a case, in the black community, and some of us even on the show, I know why, for one, I didn't really think that dogfighting was that big of a deal. But you had a lot of black folks that said, well, why did he go to jail? You shouldn't have went to jail at all. And then, the general mass media felt a different way about it and thought that he didn't get enough time. So the thought being black protectionism is kind of a bias that goes into analyzing an athlete. How do you feel about that, both inside sports and outside of sports? Is it good for the athlete or good for the subject?
And black protectionism is never a term that has ever factored into my worldview. It's never a term that I've used. It's not a dominant approach that I have in looking at the world, in large part because I think black people need all the protection they can get. So if there is such a thing as black protectionism, then I think we should maintain it. And the reason that I say that is, in the same way that we could argue that, folks had Michael Vick's back, we could also argue that someone like him would be incarcerated for being engaged in dogfighting, whereas, maybe some white athletes may have been engaged in something where someone could have resulted in being killed or something even more, other heinous crimes and served no time, right? So there's always a double standard, especially when we're talking about incarceration and a penal system for what black men, black athletes included in that, will get, over and above their white counterparts. So if we are talking about black protectionism, what we're talking about is the desire that the black community has to protect its own, because they know that they're a part of a system that is socially, economically unfair to them. And I'm not saying that there's never a bias, right? There's always going to be a bias. There's even a bias in the fact that we let all these hip-hop artists get away with being drug dealers for decades, or years throughout their upbringing, making tons of songs about it, rapping about it, celebrating it, and then turning around and not giving back to the community. We let them get away with that, right? But we also understand the environment that they were a part of that made them feel they had limited choices. And so we look at all of this in a grand context of things, and we say, you know what, at the end of the day, it is our duty to protect our own. And it's interesting that we're talking about this in the context of affirmative action when the Supreme Court is actually debating whether or not there's still a need for race to be factored into, college admissions. And I'm a big advocate of affirmative action, because I feel like until the playing field is leveled, right, until all things are equal, there is a need to factor in how unfairly and unjustly treated black men and women and Latino women are, in various aspects of society.
Right. Now the example that B. Austin used, he used Michael Vick getting arrested. I understand everything you're saying about that. The only problem I have with the whole situation when you bring it back into sports is when people translate that into, they translate that protectionism into overstating one's ability on the court, the basketball court, the football field, or whatever the athlete plays. That's the only time when I have a problem with it. And I think as an athlete, the protectionism may actually hinder you as an athlete, because if everybody's telling you that you're so much greater than you already are, it may stop you from working as hard as you can work to be the best that you can be. But, the way you took it outside of sports, I totally understand what you're saying.
But let me quickly respond to that and say I don't think that that's black protectionism. I think that's black stereotyping or stigma, because what you're talking about is more so assumptions that are made about athletic ability of black men, particularly over and above white men. And so if you see an African-American man with a certain, build, you would assume that he's going to play basketball better than his white counterpart. And that's not protectionism. These are age-old stereotypes. These are stigmas about what we are capable of doing. Oftentimes, we're believed to be more physically strong than we are intellectually strong, in relation to our white counterparts. So I do think that's harmful to athletes, but that's not protecting them. I think that's placing them in a box.
Let me give you an example of kind of what I mean. Like if we're taking an objective approach, talking about Michael Vick or Donovan McNabb, and we're just talking about what they do on the football field, has nothing to do with them personally. If we say anything that's critical, we get a lot of black people who tell us that, we shouldn't be critical of these players because they're black and because we're black. But that would take away from us doing our job as sports analysts if we couldn't be totally honest and totally objective when analyzing an athlete. So that's the point that I was making.
I see what you're saying. We had that conversation on Urban Cusp. One of my writers, Timothy Jones, wrote about LeBron James and, why he thinks that LeBron gets the criticism that he gets. And he did argue that he thinks a lot of it is rooted in race and racism, that if it was,
right,
a white athlete doing all the same things that LeBron James did or said all the same things that LeBron James said, he wouldn't get nearly as much criticism. And, I mean, there is somewhat of a point there, because part of what I think he's saying is black men, black athletes oftentimes have to be so much more conscious of not coming off as aggressive. I mean, this is coming up right now with the presidential debate.
I was just about to ask you about that.
Right. So,
yeah,
we could go there, yeah.
Okay. It's election season, of course, so we'd definitely be remiss if we didn't ask the founder of Urban Cusp about the presidential race. Just like we were just saying, in sports, aggression is celebrated and is basically a requirement for success. Now, there's a public sentiment going around that President Obama should be more aggressive in this campaign, in the debates, even in his presidency altogether. However, there's the threat of him looking like the angry black man, quote unquote, if he does, but people may think that he lacks confidence if he doesn't. So what's the balance that you think a black man in his position of power, or any black man in any type of power, what's the balance between confidence and charisma and coming off as angry or overly aggressive? What do you think that balance is?
I think it's a nearly impossible, balance. I think it plays out so well in sports because of how many athletes we know and love have reputations tarnished by, lashing out against fans on the court or, cursing out a referee, actually hitting someone and attacking them. And we have these images shown over and over again of black men's inability to control themselves, their inability to respond to disappointment or defeat. And it's a part of this larger narrative that black men are animalistic, something to be afraid of. And I think Barack Obama specifically has been dealing with this all along. I mean, if you remember when he was a candidate and he had those images of Curious George and he was constantly being depicted as a monkey. I mean, we have to remember how loaded that racism was and has been throughout his whole entire campaign, and so it's a real threat. I mean, he faces these piercing eyes in ways that no other president has because of his race. So in some ways, I applaud him because it is his control, his demeanor, his sophistication. Now, the flip side, the caveat is you never want to lose yourself in that, right? Because you also have to transcend above fear and say, regardless of what the stereotypes are, I'm not going to allow them to stop me from being me. Because he ultimately won on a platform of selling himself and where he came from and who he is. So if he can't convince us that he's still that confident, outspoken, I'm the man for this job, if he can't convince us that he's still that man, then what's going to get him reelected?
Right. All right.
Okay. Rahel, this is Akil again. Before I ask the last question, I just wanted to give a shout-out to the Habesha community in Eritrea, your home country, and my wife happens to be from Ethiopia and kind of had a similar story coming here and not be able to speak English and come to college graduate and working as a professional now. So I just wanted to give you a shout out for that. Now,
I appreciate that.
and I love injera dorowit. I haven't had kutfo yet, but we try to.
Wait, I haven't had kitfo yet, so don't feel bad.
Okay. And for those that don't know, kitfo
I
is
have
like
no idea what y'all talking about.
it's a beef that isn't really cooked that much, and they had spices to it, and supposedly it's really good, but I haven't had it yet. Now, please tell our listeners how to find your site, your writing, and anything else you'd like to promote.
Definitely. urbancusp.com, which is the word urban, URBAN, cusp, CUSP as in Paul.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter @urbancusp. I'm also on Twitter, which is my first name, Rahel, Rahiel, last name T. And lastly, definitely check out my articles on the Washington Post. I write for 3 different sections, but if you just Google my name and Washington Post, all my articles will come up.
Okay, Rahel, thank you again for joining us in the War Room tonight. We thoroughly enjoyed it, and we hope to have you back someday. We actually have to get some of your sports writers on, too, to talk about some of the articles they write, because we find them very interesting. And it's more along the social lines like we like to talk about.
Yeah, they would love that. So I'll be sure to connect you to them. And thank you so much for having me. You all are a great team, and I really appreciate all your work.
All right. Thank you.
Man.
Thank you. Good night, guys.
Rahiel Tesfamariam, everybody.
Kuwait, it's the War Room with 5 nights at the round table. 5 Philly guys diversified and educated.